Hello and welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about behavioural science because that's sort of all we're qualified to do.
Exactly.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe.
And what are we talking about today, Mela?
Today we are going to look into the use, but maybe even more importantly, the abuse of behavioral science in public policy. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work at all, and it backfires horribly.
Okay, well, I'm really excited for this episode. Partly
Same.
Because as a very, very young researcher, I'm talking about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was very, very excited by the concept of nudge. You know, not really knowing too much about it. I'd read the book. I thought it was pretty cool. And I was like, this is sort of what I want to do with my life. And now 2 to 3 years into the PhD, I don't know whether I've just become more skeptical because, you know, I've been taught to think very critically. Yeah.
Sure,
or
yes.
whether or not the more I'm sort of learning about research, the less attractive nudge sort of looks to me. I don't know. What's your opinion?
If Sunstein and Thaler ever listen to this, we're never going to get ahead in behavioral science after this.
Well, no, look.
No, I'm gonna back you up. Don't worry about it. I'm not throwing just you in front of the train. I'll put myself down there on the track as well. I've read Nudge. I thought it was one of the best written behavioral science books, and that's not saying much because I have a love-hate relationship with most of them, at least the pop science books. I thought it was interesting. I didn't read it to get into behavioral science because I didn't read that book until the end of my master's, which wasn't behavioral science, so that's a questionable move to begin with. And I think a lot of good can be done with nudging. I think it's an interesting tool. If someone comes to me arguing that nudging is a theory, it is not a theory, it is a tool. There is no, but this is something that really gets to me because a lot of people are like, oh, we should really discuss nudge theory. There is no theory behind it. It's just the theory of influence, the theory of how we think. So dual system reasoning is an important part of nudge. But nudging itself isn't a theory. It's a tool to change behaviors. That is what that is. And if someone comes up to me arguing about nudge theory, I don't mean that, to cause any personal offense, but I will just tune out. I am not arguing that with you. I'm not listening to you. Just leave me alone. So that is my first issue that I have with nudge. Misinterpretation. Okay. I've got a list.
Here we go.
I think it's oversimplified, overhyped. I think it is too big an aspect of what most people think behavioral science is, because there is much more to behavioral science. There is even much more to behavioral public policy than just nudging. So, quite frankly, I think there's more ways to change behavior. I think there's better ways to understand behavior. And I think when it comes to public policy, nudging ain't all that. So
give credit to nudge where it's due. It's become incredibly popular. It's potentially become, I guess, a gateway drug to behavioral science.
I can see where you're coming from, and I don't think it's bad that people come to behavioral science with the idea of like, oh, nudges, cool, let's do some nudging. Because, we get out of bed as behavioral scientists and we're like, oh my god, yes, let's do some nudges. Or, whatever people think that we do. But no, it's just the idea that if you come into behavioral science thinking it's all nudging and stuff, I don't know whether then if you see what else behavioral science is, where that's like, oh my god, there's so much more, yippee-yay, or whether it's, oh my god, there is so much more, I know nothing about this, what the fuck is this? I'm not entirely sure which way it goes.
Yeah, it's one of these things where it will be pretty clear pretty quickly if you start to read into behavioral science that there is a lot more to being a practitioner or even understanding behavioral science than what nudge can give you. As you said, nudge is a framework. I think that it is an incredibly amazing example of a behavioral science marketing campaign.
Sure.
In a sense that it's very a reproducible framework. It's packaged very nicely. It's very glossy.
Half of the time it doesn't work.
Well, you can argue that what it does achieve is that it starts to get people thinking about the ways in which they can see the world through a behavioral type lens. Try to encourage testing new things before you implement them across the board.
Yeah.
But as you said, maybe there is a case to be made that Nudge is given way more credit than it's due.
We should also mention halfway through, Sarah now suddenly being much more defensive of Nudge than I am. I don't do nudging in my research. Sarah does.
Okay, you can argue I'm trying to be devil's advocate here. But so this is the thing that I think is quite interesting. So when I started the PhD, I was excited to market my research as research on nudging. Now, 3 years into the PhD, my terminology has changed a little bit. My terminology is now behavioral interventions. And I think the biggest thing that I've been interested in are the mechanisms that go on behind successful and unsuccessful behavioral interventions. That's sort of what I'm really interested in. Yeah. And I think what nudging is mostly really concerned about is sort of just figuring out what works. Yeah. So for me, when I started, I was like, okay, let's think about nudges in terms of designing cool interventions, basing them in behavioral science. But I always wanted to go that one step further. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting. So you could see what I do as nudging.
No. I remember first meeting you and because I've seen you present your topic multiple times. Like we might not be at the same institution, but we do go to the same conferences and stuff like that. And I've seen you present your stuff. Initially I thought it was nudging, but the more I know about your research, the more you have deviated from nudging. And the deeper you go, the more you deviate from nudging, because quite frankly, when it comes to nudging, I think it's quite superficial. And as soon as you dive deeper and you go away from the effect and you go into understanding the effect, manipulating the effect, you're no longer nudging. At least to me, disclaimer and a half here, to me, that is no longer nudging. The moment you go deep, it's no longer nudging.
And that's interesting, because that's what we've been told is the difference between marketing and behavioral science, right?
So nudging is just marketing?
Potentially.
Uh-oh.
I mean, well, it's something that I think could be discussed. Where does nudging fall between the marketing and behavioral science?
Tune in for the next episode where we discredit an entire field with a marketing guru of your choice.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. We don't actually have that episode planned, although we have discussed that we should talk about the difference between marketing and behavioral science. So stay tuned for that. We'll update all the socials once we've recorded that one, because that is actually an episode I'd really, really like to do. To get back to the topic, because so far we've only discussed our hatred of nudge and nothing else about public policy. So I don't think we're doing well. This is going to be a very rambly episode.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, we're interviewing someone that I think both, I speak for Mella and myself, we both massively respect this person so much. She's kind of a bit of a role model for us. I don't know whether she knows this.
I've never told her, because I feel it comes across as brown nosing, but it's, no, I like her work a lot. I like her as a person a lot. Every presentation I've ever seen of her, I really, really enjoyed. So I'm very happy that she's here. And I think we should just, we should by this stage just introduce her, because we're just complaining about nudge. So this episode is actually about public policy, and that sometimes behavioral science works for it and sometimes behavioral science doesn't work for it. And we should just stop rambling and introduce our interviewee, who is Ganna Pogrebna, role model to women in behavioral science, at least the two women that you're currently listening to. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
Take it away, Ganna. And today we're actually talking to Ganna Pogrebna. And of course, you know the format by this stage. We prefer our interviewees to introduce themselves. So Ganna, would you mind introducing yourself? Who are you? What do you do? What do you want from life?
So first of all, Merle, Sarah, thanks a lot for having me. This is a great opportunity to talk about topics I'm really enjoying. Yeah, as for who I am, I'm a decision theorist. My main role currently is I am leading behavioral data science stream at the Alan Turing Institute. I'm also a university professor. And basically what I do for a living, I write mathematical models of human behavior, and I test these models using various types of data. So that's what I do.
I like the term decision theorist.
Yeah, decision theory is very, it's like a subset of game theory. So if you look at the field of economics, well, that's pretty kind of normally pretty miserable people who are trying to predict economic outcomes. Then within this miserable bunch, you have even more miserable bunch of game theorists. And if you take the extreme of the miserable, that's decision theorists. So that's us, because we're trying to predict normally individual behavior and then generalize it to population. And why we're miserable, I will explain, is because we're trying to predict behavior. So we write models, but then people do not behave according to models. And that's kind of creates a problem, because you constantly are rewriting the models. So you write a model, it doesn't work, you rewrite it, you test it again.
So it's like an iterative process that never ends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
okay, sounds like purgatory.
Yeah.
It just never ends. Okay, I think that's the best introduction we've had so far. So how do you get into being part of this miserable bunch, as you've called it yourself? How do you get into this type of profession?
I mean, I always kind of wanted to work on human behavior, but I started as a traditional economist. So basically, I just studied traditional economics, supply, demand, macro and microeconomics. But then I think in 2003, I actually got into a lecture by Andreas Ortmann, who is a very famous experimentalist, and he's awesome. And the lecture was very small. It was, I think, in Charles University of Prague. It was like for 20 students. And during this lecture, he was running some experiments. And I thought, oh, actually, this is what I want to do. So this is how I kind of started in behavioral science. But then I did a PhD in economic and social sciences, but my area during the PhD was risk-taking, so individual and group risk-taking. And my dissertation was actually on TV shows. So I analyzed behavior in Deal or No Deal television show, basically in television shows where people play for large amounts of money. So we had essentially, a playground with different TV shows with my supervisor, and I did a lot of work on that. But then, currently I don't actually do traditional behavioral science, but that was my journey into behavioral science.
So what type of behavioral science do you do now, would you say?
So currently I do basically what I call behavioral data science, and essentially that's hybrid models between behavioral science and data science. It's very computer scientish, but it still deals with writing mathematical models of human behavior, just at a very large scale.
All right.
So out of interest, what types of behaviors are you particularly interested in, or is it sort of all over the map, the types of things that you've sort of looked at through this lens?
I had quite a few bosses throughout my career, and most of them were telling me that I need to concentrate on something. And in the end, I didn't concentrate on anything. And I just think that that's kind of my trademark, that I don't actually concentrate on anything apart from human behavior. But essentially, there are currently, I think, several topics emerged. basically in behavioral science, I did mostly risk-taking behavior. I have awards in this, so like in this topic, so I was actually quite good at it. But then in 2013, I got a job in engineering department, and the reason why I got a job in engineering department is because I was doing really methodological work. Like I was writing theories, and then I was testing them in the laboratory, like the majority of behavioral scientists do. And then I thought, I do all this work, but it never actually gets into practice. So I want to see how I can work on practical applications. And I got a job at a project that was actually putting a bunch of sensors into people's homes and measuring consumer behavior. So essentially, I think currently I work on mostly consumer behavior, smart cities, and cybersecurity. So that's kind of the three aspects where I kind of feel very comfortable.
And ironically, we're not going to discuss any of those today because today's talk is about policy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all related to policy, especially when you talk about cities. For example, my current project at the Alan Turing Institute is looking into happiness in cities. So it's very, very much policy related. It's about how do you design environments that best fit people's interests. But I think in principle, it's any work that you do in behavior, in behavioral science in particular, if you would take kind of this interdisciplinary work between economics, psychology, and engineering and computer science that I do, it is always related to policy in some way.
And I guess when we think about behavioural public policy or behavioural applications within public policy, I think the sort of three words that will probably jump to most people's minds when they think about this are the Behavioural Insights team. So set up in the UK, originally set up inside the cabinet, now has become its own sort of semi-private institution. Just what are your opinions about the Behavioural Insights team, about how they implement behavioural insights into policy? Just off the bat, what do you make of them?
I think there are two aspects of this question here. So the first aspect is generally about behavioral insights and behavioral science and policy, and the second question is about behavioral insights team.
Right.
So first of all, the behavioral interventions by policymakers did not start with behavioral insights team. It has a very, very long history. Behavioral insights team in the UK, if we just take UK unit, we have various units around the world. So if we take just UK, they were founded in 2010. And behavioral interventions in general were running way before that. So I can give you very simple example that probably everybody can relate to, and that's smoking bans. Smoking bans in US started in 1970s. I think Arizona was the first state that implemented a smoking ban in 1973, and then it eventually spreads, to the whole US. And by 2006, every state in the US was basically banning smoking in public places. If we take UK, again, we have way before 2010 when smoking bans were introduced and implemented. And similar in Australia, I think it started in 1999, and by 2004, basically smoking was banned. And this is an example of behavioral intervention because, the policy basically looked at how to discourage smoking behavior, and it worked for two reasons. The first reason that obviously everyone who doesn't smoke doesn't like to be near people who do smoke.
True.
And the second reason is that, smokers always want to quit smoking. So you have one side of population who actually saw direct benefit, and the other side of population thought, if they ban smoking in restaurants, I probably will smoke less. So, and that's kind of the type of stuff that makes these behavioral insights or behavioral policy much broader than just something that relates to behavioral insights team. Well, and in terms of the second part of the question, and kind of my opinion generally on these behavioral interventions from the government. Unfortunately, I'm gonna be acting as a lawyer a little bit here and say that it depends. Of course, it depends on many things, but I was thinking that I could just give you maybe two examples. One when it went really well, so I think that's kind of it can't get any better than this, and then when it went horribly wrong. So the good example, in my opinion, I really like it. It's very recent. It was done last year. And this is an example from Germany. So there was a campaign that was called "No Need to Fly." If you guys don't know it, if you're listening to this podcast, check it out. There are YouTube videos of it; they're amazing.
We will make sure to have it linked below.
So the point of the campaign was, in Germany, 72% of German population actually travel abroad when they take vacations. Mm-hmm. And Deutsche Bahn, well, for those of you who don't know, Deutsche Bahn is a private company, but German government is the main shareholder of that private company. So it is kind of a mix of a private-public funding in there. But basically, first of all, German government wanted to encourage people to travel internally in Germany. And second, obviously Deutsche Bahn wanted to increase its impact and increase revenue. So they basically formulated a campaign that actually combines behavioral methods and data science methods. And what they did was they basically looked at iconic landscapes in most sought after tourist destinations, and they using Flickr and Facebook, they found kind of almost complete replicas in Germany. So they would show you, so the campaign went like this. They would show you, for example, a location in Arizona, and they would show you an almost the same identical picture, but they would say that is in Rhineland, Germany. Right?
Oh, clever.
And then they would say it would cost you 1,000 plus euros to go to Arizona, but it would only cost you 19 euros to go to Rhineland.
Clever.
And, so that's this is a great. So what happened as a result? It had a 7% conversion rate. But doesn't sound like a lot, but at the country scale, it's a lot. Some percent of people actually started to travel more internally. It increased the revenue of Deutsche Bahn, and it was done in privacy-preserving way. So it actually, like I said, it doesn't get any better. So you have a fantastic policy result. People travel more internally. You raise awareness about internal tourism. You increase the revenue of a local business. And people are happy as well because they spend less money on pretty much the same, type of results. So I mean that's a good thing. So that's where you can have an intervention that where we see kind of the government working together with a private company and getting this really nice results.
Couldn't be any better. It's actually quite ironic though, because I'm from the southeast of the Netherlands, and when I go on holiday with my parents, we go to Germany a lot because the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald, is there, which is an absolutely great area. If that area was in the Netherlands, I'd be there very, very often. No, but this is the thing. I mean, the lucky thing with this intervention is that Germany has a lot of beautiful areas to promote. If you're in a country where those areas aren't as present, this would be more difficult. But it's a great policy. I think the result for this is great.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised. Like, we actually replicated kind of this type of idea at the University of Birmingham, where we basically took pictures of, at the University of Birmingham, we have like a really nice campus, and there is we actually have kind of our own tower. It's called Old Joe and all that. So yeah, we actually looked at how can we increase kind of awareness about what is on campus, what type of museums are on campus. So we kind of did like a small version of that within the university, and people started to go to the museum more often than we have on campus. And so you can actually even with small scale, you can make this type of campaign really successful. So it's actually very, very nice.
Cool.
So let me kind of go back to your
Sure.
question and give you an example of bad thing.
Yes, please. I'm excited already.
Well, that is actually coming from Behavioral Insights team. I'm not saying that everything that they did was bad, but this particular thing is something that I personally was really concerned about, and I even signed an open letter and supported people who were kind of in the media saying that that's crazy. And that was, of course, the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when Behavioral Insights unit came out and said that we don't need to quarantine because that would lead to fatigue, and people just need to wash their hands. And I mean, I completely appreciate the limitations that they had. They probably just had someone from the cabinet coming to them and saying, we need quick advice on this. And they made this, they made these decisions, and they made they basically produced this advice based on information they had at the time. However, what is scary is that it's like really anonymous. Like, we don't know who these people who produced the underlying research, where did they get this result about fatigue? It just was on all front pages everywhere, and we don't know. Like, these people are basically anonymous, and we don't know why they decided that this was a great idea. So I'm actually glad that many behavioral scientists said, well, actually that has nothing to do with behavioral science. But in principle, if you think about the current effects of COVID, we will only know in a few years' time how damaging that was, really, because as you know, currently UK has one of the highest death rates in Europe, at least. I don't know about world, but in Europe I'm pretty sure. And essentially, part of it is probably because we didn't start quarantine on time. So I think that it's really you need to be responsible with these things, and when you have a rash decision like this, you need to consult the scientific community, not just make a decision within one particular team. So that's kind of the example. So in terms of my feeling is it depends, and really depends on what you do and the context in which you do it.
So from a behavioral science perspective, what do you think could have been done better with regards to how the pandemic was approached?
Well, I think that, there is, even now, we observe a lot of things that are not done. I mean, we probably could return to this later, but if you look at, for example, the NHS app, we have no idea how anxious people are, how stressed they are. The studies, we have a lot of studies running at the moment, but no one has produced any, reliable psychological studies on how, a quarantine actually affects people, and what is going to happen when we all come out. I'm particularly concerned, for example, about the children, because I have a son who's 3, and he's a very kind of communication is key for him, but these kids, they do not have an opportunity to communicate with each other because of quarantine, and these types of things are not studied. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in order to understand what we need to do some work on this. And we haven't done enough work to be able to provide any reliable advice, simply because we don't know we don't know the psychological effects, we don't know the behavioral effects. Everything that I see in the media is mostly speculation, like people are affected, whatever, right? So, but you need to actually be armed with science, and you need to actually say, okay, this is what we had before, and this is what we have during the crisis, and this is what we have after the crisis. And COVID, I think, is a great opportunity to test things, but we don't have enough knowledge to be able to provide any reliable advice. So that's what we need to keep in mind when we talk about these things.
I also signed that open letter you mentioned about behavioural fatigue.
Thank you.
I think that's a great example. Yeah, no.
I was really applauding Nick Chater. So Nick Chater, if you don't know who that is, Nick Chater is a very famous psychologist from. I know you guys know, but for the audience.
Of course.
If you don't know Nick Chater, so Nick Chater is a very famous psychologist, and it was really big of him to write an article in The Guardian about this intervention, because not only that he is a famous guy, but also he was affiliated with Behavioural Insights Unit.
Right.
So he basically said that, like, we don't all agree even within, even though I work with these guys, I don't agree with them. So, and I advise policymakers. So I want you to understand that, this is not a good idea, and I disagree. So, and I think that's great.
For sure.
I think that's great.
Yeah. And I think that this sort of touches on something really quite interesting, that, at the moment, an institution like the Behavioural Insights team seems to have a lot of power and influence over the government, if we just take this behavioural fatigue as an example. But what we don't really see from the Behavioural Insights team is a lot of transparency in, as you said, how they came to these conclusions, or, how they came to these insights that they're applying. So do you think that that's something that institutions like, not just including the Behavioural Insights team, but institutions like the Behavioural Insights team could be doing better, having more academic rigour and having more transparency in the ways in which they come to conclusions about what insights are relevant for policy?
Yeah, I think it's not always the same. For example, I know of the work that Behavioural Insights team did, for example, with financial regulators. So normally that is not anonymous, like you have names. At least the person who wrote the report, who that was. I think I think Behavioural Insights team is a perfect reflection of the culture we have in academia, because Behavioural Science team represents one of the top schools in the UK, and so there's basically one of the really sought after institutions. And when you're coming from that in that type of breed, people just tend to trust, because I think it's quality. It equates quality. Sure. I think what it tells you is that you can be really well educated, but at the same time you can still make mistakes. At least the current example of COVID shows that you can make mistakes. But I completely agree with you that on some of the things that they do, there could be more transparency. But this, in a sense, these people are not anonymous. You can go on the website and look at each profile and see where they're from and what they do. But in terms of report, like, what I'm worried about is not the fact that we don't know their names. Okay, that's fine in a sense. They took responsibility as an organization for certain things, but we don't know what science this intervention is based on. Normally there is no transparency about, we have done these types of tests, we have received these results, they are published in peer-reviewed journals or something like this. So normally that's where the problem lies. So I think we don't know where these insights are coming from, and that's and that's and they might have a perfectly legit reason to argue for certain types of implementations, but the fact that we don't know what evidence is there, is really scary. And we saw in other fields where we don't have evidence, but we just make assumptions. Like, for example, again, coming back to children, the majority of studies with children have very small samples, we're talking about like 20 people in a study. And we don't know this. We just know the result, right? So what you're told is that, okay, this is the result of this study, but you don't know anything about, the sample size, the spread of, in which countries they tested these samples. So I think that's more of a problem than, just, transparency in terms of like who that was. Although I would personally, I would like to know who advised on, the government on this particular issue. Yeah. I don't think
you're ever gonna get that name. I think that's gonna be very well hidden.
Not, but I would like to.
Sure. I have to admit, to be honest, that I never heard of behavioral fatigue before they came out with that as an approach to COVID. I never heard of it. I initially thought they meant something like ego depletion or just getting tired of something. Behavioral fatigue was a term I never heard of. Did you?
Behavioral fatigue, yes, it is an established concept in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't, we're living through an event that happens maybe once in 100 years. You have to understand that this is a big major event. It's not like many people have experienced in their lifetime. Mm-hmm. So, and when we talk about, isolating people, again, it depends. Like, for example, I'm quite lucky. I can get out and about in a park, and I can, I have a big garden where I can get out. But, if you are stuck in a little apartment somewhere in, the middle of London, you will have some mental health consequences, whether you like it or not. If you can find one small place, that is going to have quite an impact on you, and there will be a lot of individual heterogeneity, in this impact. So because some people, when we talk about working from home, I think academics are very comfortable in working from home, right? We do that a lot. We have normally everybody has like one day when they work from home, at least.
Oh, at least
when you're a professor, anyway, that's true. So maybe on the other days you're teaching and stuff. But if we take any other person from private sector, they have 9-to-5 job.
Mm-hmm.
There will be an effect on them, but it's just that it's just to say that it will be fatigue.
Sure.
Maybe it will be anxiety. Some people are not comfortable with closed spaces. They're not comfortable being inside for a long time, and this is something that needs to be factored in. So I think that it's just like I said, it just doesn't. We cannot rush with these things. We need to understand the phenomenon first before we provide any advice, especially when we're talking about human lives here.
Especially within behavioral science, the one thing that's been marketed to death and beyond reincarnation by this stage is nudge, which got introduced effectively as a policy tool as well. How do you feel about nudging? I'm quite curious how you feel about that as a policy tool.
So, I'm really glad that you are asking a question about policy tool rather than a theory. because I read a lot of stuff on nudging, and very often people use the word theory when they describe nudging.
No, absolutely not. I'm sorry, but that is not a theory.
Yeah, so I know that a lot of people will feel kind of betrayed right now, but folks, really, there is no such thing as nudging theory. Nope. Nudging is a method. It is a method which translates behavioral theory into practical insights. So it works like this. We have many, many theories in behavioral science, many, many models. And then what nudging does, it basically creates empirical interventions to translate this behavioral theory into insight. To answer your question about like what I think about it, again, if it's done correctly, it's perfectly legit. So but again, what we normally observe is not really, scientific. I just read a brilliant article by Karen Chester. So she's a policy. I didn't know about her, but before I read the article, but she's a policymaker in Australia. And she's like she works in finance, basically financial regulator of some sort. And she was talking in that article about weapons of mass influence. And I just thought it's such a great, it's a really cool phrase because, a lot of times what we observe with nudging is basically, what often happens is that, especially in private sector, not so much in policy, but in private sector for sure, that happens a lot. When interventions are done maybe with best intentions, but then ultimately they hurt the well-being of the customer. So, and that's what she's talking about. So she says that, these are weapons of mass influence and we need to regulate them somehow. So, and I think a lot of you can blame a lot of this on nudging theory. And there are currently several terms for kind of nudges gone bad. So these are sludges, grudges, phishing. But I think that, in terms of nudges going badly, I think the best example is, of course, Cambridge Analytica, by far. It just overshoots by far anything else you can imagine. Because, and that's a perfect example, again, of unintended consequences, because I'm sure when Facebook was designed, it was a fun tool. No one was thinking that it could hurt democracy in any shape or form, and it basically did, right? So we actually saw mass harvesting, right? But there were actually several factors actually were combined in this case, which is awesome for kind of doing studies on this, because on the one hand you have the intention of winning, a political race being present there, and that's why you are trying to just swing some, voters on your side, which is kind of perfectly legit goal. And everybody, I think, if you're a politician, you would be a bad politician if you didn't want that.
Sure.
But then there is also, the figure of the researcher here. So we have, for those of you who are not familiar with the case, so we had Alexander Kogan, who basically was a researcher. Well, actually, surprisingly, he still is affiliated with University of Cambridge. So he basically worked in psychology in University of Cambridge, and essentially what he did, he wrote an app that released questionnaires on Facebook. And again, if you're not familiar with psychological questionnaires on Facebook, the majority of them are intended only to collect your personal data. They're not trying to tell you whether you are more conscientious or better person, or whether you love your husband and he loves you back. They are actually designed to collect data about you, about who you are. Anyways, so, and he used this tool, but the problem was that he included this clause about informed consent, so he did have a consent form, right? As we do in the majority of studies that we are running, when we are running them with human subjects, we always have consent forms and information sheets. So, and in this consent form, if you have ever downloaded an app on your smartphone, you never read these terms and conditions, anything that the company tells you. And basically, so when we look at this consent form, one of the things that was kind of written in small font there was that along with your Facebook profile, the researchers could also access Facebook profiles of all your friends on Facebook. So as a result, the actual app, the actual questionnaire reached, 300,000 people maybe. But in the end, the profiles of, I read different numbers in the press, but between 50 million and 87 million profiles were actually harvested by.
Yeah, of course. If everyone has like 500 friends, that works out fine.
Yeah. So the problem here was not, so the problem, there are two problems, right? The first of all, you have a researcher who says, I'm collecting data for research and then sells this data for profit. That's the problem number one. Mm-hmm. And like when you do that as a researcher, there probably should be a thought at the back of your mind that you're doing something wrong, right? But in this particular case, it also, so it also was that so many people were affected because they didn't give consent. So like they could have my Facebook profile and I don't know about it, right? So that's the thing that's really scary. And who could have thought that this would happen? And then the second thing, why Cambridge Analytica is such a big deal is it was actually based on solid science. So the way these tools work is basically in computer science is called collaborative filtering, right? So they, if you don't know what it is, if you ever bought something from Amazon, you do know what it is. So when you go on Amazon and buy something, they normally tell you people who bought this also bought this, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's exactly how these algorithms work. They basically look at what you bought, what someone else bought, and then they offer the items of that person to you and your items to them, right? Yeah. Similarly, you can do this for political views. So, for example, Merle, I don't know your political views, but let's just say you are a liberal.
Sure.
I don't know that. Right? And I can just look at your Facebook network and I can see that, 70% in your network are liberal. So I'm just going to assume that you're liberal, right? So that's how it's done, right? What this particular intervention, it is a behavioral intervention done on a large scale. But what it produced, basically, it produced really segregated groups, right? Because people who were, for example, if we take Trump versus Hillary Clinton campaign, right? People who were really fans of Trump, they would only get positive news about Trump. And the people who were fans of Hillary would only get positive news about Hillary. So they wouldn't see any negative news. And in the end, both, so the side that was really that didn't win, so the Democrats, so they were really disappointed because everything was going well, right? Everything was going well. And that's why these two groups are so polarized. Like the polarization is unbelievable. So I'm not saying that Facebook, like this particular Cambridge Analytica campaign of Facebook, contributed to this primarily, but it was one of the factors that contributed to this polarization. And that's what's scary, and that's what is scary about nudges, because you can have purely what you think benign technology that allows you to connect with your friends, but at the same time, it's it can go completely wrong at any point in time.
Yeah. No, it is terrifying. It's this idea that the nudge itself might not, be good or bad, but it's the application and the person behind it that has, as you said, this weapons of mass influence. It is absolutely staggering. I mean, I think the world is now, I guess, a little bit more switched on to these tools that are out there and the influence that they can have. So I guess the question is how do we regulate this sort of behavioral science being used?
Well, in terms of regulation, there are textbook principles of nudging, right? There is basically three principles that Richard Taylor articulated. So the guy who wrote this whole, book on nudging and got a Nobel Prize for it. So basically, these interventions, according to Taylor, they should be transparent and not misleading. They have to be designed in such a way that people could easily opt out. And then they also should improve the well-being of those who are nudged. So these are the 3 principles. So if you follow these 3 principles, then in principle, you don't need regulation, right? There is talk about licensing, So yeah, of course, I'm not a Nobel Prize winner, but
not yet. Come on, we're gonna be optimistic.
From my personal standpoint, I think there is a secret sauce to this recipe, and that's the personal ethics of the researcher. Because, you need to understand what you are doing, and if you feel that something is going wrong, you should definitely stop doing what you're doing and kind of regroup and think about it. I can give you an example. So I actually, with a friend of mine, we were trying to. So we're really concerned about homelessness in London. And we basically wanted to write an app that would recognize people in the street. So we wanted to work with City of London and recognize people in the street in the spots where they are, and basically direct them to the nearest shelter. So, I mean, it would not be the homeless people who would actually be consumers, but it would be volunteers of the shelters who would have this information, that there is a person on this street in sub-zero temperatures, probably they need to come into the shelter. But then we were thinking of all the cons of developing this technology, because it would... it would victimize the people who are, in this position, and we don't know how this technology is going to be used. It could be used for surveillance. The learning algorithm that we will develop could be used for personal surveillance of other people other than homeless people. So all these things, and you kind of take into consideration before you start the project. And, it can only be done by personal barometer. If you have your personal barometer telling you that probably that's not a great idea, then, it's not a great idea. And, you can even have completely fantastic ideas, very pro-social. And, even then there could be raised some, important objections. Again, I can give you an example. So we were talking to a company that was trying to develop a food bank app. And the food bank app would actually direct people who need to get food. There are actually very many families in the UK, I don't know the exact percentage, but trust me, it's a sizable number, that are suffering from hunger. So people don't actually have enough food in the fridge to feed the family. So it's a big problem. And they wanted to create, create an app that would tell them, actually, this food bank would have food stock on this on this day, and kind of give them some ideas of where they could get help. So seems like great idea, right? Fantastic idea from policy perspective. But the problem, again, lies with ethics, because on the one hand, you're creating a great thing. On the other hand, you're creating dependencies. So you're basically discouraging these people in a way from, maybe trying to improve their economic position, maybe try to find a better job, try to get training. It's not necessarily going to happen, but it might happen. So you need to think about these things before So, I mean, in terms of regulation, I personally support the licensing idea. I think there should be training and licensing for behavioral science interventions. It could be, that when you graduate with a degree, you automatically get it. But maybe people who don't have these certifications, who are working in companies in marketing, in empirical marketing or digital marketing, and claim that they do behavioral science, they probably should get certified.
Sure, that seems fair. Are they also, so is a lack of certification and is a lack of training one of the main reasons why certain interventions backfire, would you argue? Or are there many other factors that can make something backfire, as we have seen with the lack of quarantine and the behavioral fatigue as implemented in the UK?
Yeah, so I think there are it's a big question, and there are, I mean, at least off the top of my head, I can think of 7 big reasons why things fail.
Great.
So the main, the first thing that you mentioned is the expertise problem. the expertise problem is a very big problem in behavioral science because, when there is a question about astrophysics or heart surgery, it's very difficult to bullshit people, right? And that's why normally the people who are asked actually did a little bit of astrophysics and quite a bit of heart surgery, right? But when we talk about behavioral science, first of all, we never talk about precision here. We talk about, social stuff, which is very floating and very uncertain and difficult to sort of to work with. So there are so many experts, and normally the people who are asked are not actually haven't done any studies on the topic. So they have, I don't know, millions of Instagram followers, millions of YouTube followers, and this is what matters, right? Because you just get a great figure. And I'm not saying like, if you're a comedian, you probably have an opinion and you want to say something, and probably your opinion should be heard, but it should not be presented as a piece of evidence or expert opinion, right? It's just an opinion. It's not an expert opinion. So I think I
couldn't agree more.
I think there is this expertise problem, right? And again, like I said, I welcome, I think that, we should have opinions of all colors, shapes, and forms. It's awesome, but we need to separate expert opinion from other non-expert opinion, no matter how valid it is.
Sure.
So the second reason is the context. Context problem is a big problem. A recent example, very, very cool behavioral campaign by the World Health Organization on hand washing. Amazing campaign, very well done. They have engaged celebrities. They thought about, how to kind of create videos in a simple way so that, people need to wash their hands for 20 seconds. Problem is, if you are in the middle of India or in the middle of Africa, you don't have clean water. You don't have even access to water. Forget about clean water. Like, you just don't have water, period. And, this context is extremely important. So you need to constantly think at the back of your mind, okay, I'm designing this intervention. Is it realistic? Yeah. Great campaign. Yeah, we should wash our hands, but if you don't have water, you can't do it. So that's context. So then the third problem, I think it's one of my favorites, and that's the Breaking Bad problem. So kind of you have this Breaking Bad behavioral style problem. I mean, I think if I ever write a novel, it probably will be around kind of Breaking Bad in decision theory. Because, behavioral science gives you a great power to influence people, power to be, very assertive and very convincing when you need to. And that is a big danger, because when you have that power, you can really use it in the wrong way. And the problem always is that, you can have, we have a lot of businesses that want to achieve certain results. And some people just basically slide in, they basically, when you have a trade-off between business goals and ethics, you tend to slide into business goals, and it's very easy to do. And it can happen to you guys as well. So,
of course,
because like it's really exciting, and it's really cool to play God sometimes, So it's, I think, and because you can do it, right? We know from research, like I know, like from my personal research, if I ask you the same question in two different ways, you will give me two completely different answers, right? So now let's remind ourselves that in many countries, opinion polls inform public policy. So if I'm designing this opinion poll, and if a certain, entity pays me for getting a certain result, there is a big danger in kind of sliding in on that territory, right? So
a lot of people have also accused the way the Brexit decision was framed as being very, very much pushing towards one side, and that having had a massive influence on the result. So it's a framing problem.
I mean,
for sure.
Again, I'm not sure. So with Brexit campaign, I'm not sure that there was any thought put into it.
No,
there were some advertising, but I just think that that you could have really even the company sometimes has really great sort of ideas about increasing people's well-being. Like, for example, you can work on trying to reduce people's debt, but in the end you give them some new product that increases their debt, right? So you give them a new credit card, and in the end the result is the opposite. So you know, and we've seen this, like, for example, the textbook example of the reverse result is of course Israeli childcare example, right? When they introduced fines and they wanted to achieve parents coming. They just wanted parents to come on time to collect the kids. So that's very, very simple, right? But because they introduced this fine, it completely backfired. And well, don't get me wrong. So a lot of people were not late, but those who were late, they were not 15 minutes late. They were like hours late. Right, 1-2 hours late. So that's the problem. So, and that's kind of what that's what you see when you're trying to solve, like you are trying to solve a problem and get a social, maybe even socially desirable outcome. But again, it's always a trade-off. But in Breaking Bad problem, I think I'm talking about people who just take large remuneration from private company to do something they know is not right.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah. So another problem that's problem number 4, the methods, right? And we have to understand that in behavioral science, there is no such thing as solid methods. Even a randomized control trial that people think that this is like solid bulletproof. I have my control group, I have my treatment group. That's it. Well, I can completely reverse any randomized control trial if I want to. Like, I can actually disrupt it, right? So, and I think that's well, maybe not any, but some, let's just say. So that's why it's very important to have kind of checks and balances and look at the study in progress and see maybe the way you framed this study is not correct. The way you're asking the questions is not correct. Maybe people don't understand the question that you are asking. Because, very often we ask people about chances or probabilities. People have no idea how to work with probabilities. The majority of people don't know how to work with probabilities. And, so this, the method that you're using will have an impact. So you need to make sure that you have the best method.
Yeah, I think that links with the transparency point as well. Sort of particularly with the research that's been done by, I guess, non-academic bodies. We need to have transparency into how they set up their trials, how they measured outcomes, because you can
sample sizes.
Yeah, anything, all of it matters, and any one piece of that puzzle that is potentially fallible throws into question all results.
So another thing is, so that's problem number 5, and that's interpretation. You can have the best.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ever dealt with press and wrote anything, you can have the best insight and go with best intentions, but it could be interpreted in completely wrong way. So the example that comes to mind is Jamie Oliver's campaign, healthy food campaign for kids.
Oh, I remember this.
Because he did the good thing, like we should consume less sugar as a society, or I mean worldwide even, not even as a British in the UK, but like anybody in all over the world, we consume too much sugar and too much fat, and he wanted to basically reduce the amount of sugar that kids eat at school, because in school you develop these habits and the culture of eating, which is very benign, nice, legitimate type of intervention. But the way it was interpreted, and he encouraged, how do you cook healthy? How do you inform kids about the amount of sugar that they're consuming? I remember this really nice posters that he produced where it showed, iced tea, it's 20% sugar in the bottle. So it actually was drawings of how much sugar there is, right? So it's an awesome campaign, but was completely misinterpreted by the media, because the media picked on the fact that he started with a middle-class school, and they said, oh, only middle-class people care about this. No,
Jesus.
Not only middle class people care about health. Come on, everybody cares about health. But the argument is that healthier food is more expensive, so probably people with lower income cannot afford it. But that's not correct, right? And that's an example of great campaign, fantastic insights. Obviously, as a chef, he knows everything about what is healthy and what isn't healthy. There were also nutritionists working on this, and completely backfired because of misinterpretation.
That's a shame, because it sounds sound in and of itself. So it's very. It's interesting that that the reason it backfired was so external to the research and to the campaign itself. That sucks.
Yeah, as a kid growing up in the UK, Jamie Oliver is a kind of a running joke that he was the guy who took away our chicken nuggets at lunchtime. So,
oh my god,
yeah.
That's all that we remember about it, and it's funny, but it's kind of sad in the same way of actually this really well-informed, important campaign was sort of reduced to a joke.
Yeah, and that's why the majority of campaigns about healthy eating or whatever, healthy lifestyle, not healthy eating, healthy lifestyle concentrates on activity, on physical activity, and not on food, because it's very difficult to design a campaign for food because it's just goes in all sorts of directions. People start picking on little things. But, that's why I think Jamie Oliver could have used a behavioral scientist on that campaign who could have thought through, these things. Because that's what we do. Like, this is our job as behavioral scientists to actually think, okay, look, this could go this way. So probably we should prepare some pre-campaign where we talk to different groups, understand how different groups perceive healthy lifestyle. What is the perception of the cost of the campaign, because, it's basically, and the fact that he became a national joke is because, there was probably not a good, qualified behavioral scientists on that team.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about as well. So next thing, that's number 6, I think I'm already right. And that's incentive mechanisms. And we don't have to go far. It's NHSX app is a great example of that. So NHS just released a proximity app that uses Bluetooth technology to trace your contacts. And it's very important because, if you have COVID, the government wants to know who you have been in contact with, such that, we can inform other people of the potential danger that they might be infected and all these types of things. But,
sure.
The way the campaign was done, I mean, there was nothing about incentives. Like, why should I download this app? What do, I should do it for the greater good. Okay, great. But what is the greater good? I don't know who is going to access my data. I don't know what type of people are going to do analytics. Are these the same people? So is the government doing analytics? So is it Google or Apple doing analytics on my? I don't know, right? So it's this is why there are so many things and negative things in the press right now, because the proper incentive mechanism was just not designed for this. And another a final thing that I want to mention is probably the data that we work with. So data can be really misleading. So you can have tons and tons of data, and you can get an effect even. You can get an effect of a particular campaign, but you maybe can get it just because you have a lot of data and not because it means anything, right? So, or, the data is simply unreliable. I can tell you, I recently did a project, it's actually quite funny, big organization in the UK, and we had a gender variable. So there was, I know that gender is non-binary, but we had a binary variable, 0 or 1. And the company, no one in the company knew which one is which. Is one a man and 0 female, or vice versa, right? So and we actually had to physically so we had a member of data science team who had to kind of unanonymize the data to look for like one record, whether that's like female or we made an educated guess which one is which based on the results. But like, that just tells you like sometimes like you've got data and you don't even know what it means.
Gosh.
And you need to be very careful with that. So yeah, there are many reasons. I'm sure the list can continue, go on and on and on, but these are the things that I could think of.
I think these 7 points should give us a pretty decent insight into why things backfire and which conditions actually need to be met for things to not backfire, or at least to significantly reduce the risk of them backfiring. I think it's great. I think I work with data a lot as well, and the quick fix for knowing which variable measures what is to have a data dictionary. So for anyone who's in data, please write those. They're actually quite useful. Or if you get data from a third party, make sure they give you a data dictionary, because obviously for privacy and for ethical purposes, it's not ideal if you have to anonymize the data so you can figure out what you're looking at. It's not ideal. I'm curious to see if you had it your way, if the world was ideal, what would be the role of behavioral science in policy? What would that ideally look like?
Okay, so I hope that if there is an ideal world, there's not just behavioral science. I hope there's more.
Oh no!
I think you want to do things as interdisciplinary as you possibly can. So I definitely derive a lot of inspirations from people who are not in my field. And I think that's kind of the best collaborations I have. And you have someone from engineering or someone from philosophy who do completely different stuff, and they're not even aware of any behavioral theories. But in terms of making things better, I think. Again, I think it's the main thing lies with the person who does these interventions. So just think about what you want to do and whether it's the right thing to do, and just try to consider the possible consequences. Again, you are not God. You're not going to predict everything. You're not you're not fortune teller. But if you are trying to understand what type of impact your project could have in a few years' time, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to just stop and think about it, and then probably you will not make some stupid mistakes. But actually, I would encourage people to go for some crazy, completely crazy projects. Like I let my students. Sometimes a student comes to me and say, "Oh, I want to work on this," and I know that in a million years it's not going to work. I still let them do it because I think it's important to be creative, because in the process of doing this, they will figure out that it's probably not, a good idea. But if you think that you want to change the world for the better, then by all means you should try. You should have your your moment to try. You might fail, but at least you can say, "Oh, I tried."
Okay, even if it has terrible unintended consequences or not.
Sorry, but by that I just mean the ideas that you might have. But of course, I mean, if you are working with policy, then you need to probably. I mean, what often helps with policy is talking to people who know a lot about it. So people who have experience. So, because you can have the best idea, but, people with experience will tell you what type of barriers they faced before. And I'm not saying that you should always, if they say stop whatever you're doing, you should stop. It may or may not be correct thing. But, I think if you're doing something wrong, the guy with Cambridge Analytica, if you're selling personal data of research participants, that you're doing something wrong. I mean, if there's no doubt in your mind that something's wrong, right? And this is, and also I think I wish, I don't think it will ever happen, but I wish people were more aware of that they are being sometimes subjected to behavioral various behavioral campaigns. So, and that only can happen if we educate people.
So you should experiment responsibly. There's a lot of responsibility that you need to take as someone who can use these tools and try to think about whether or not the use of this tool is going to be for better or for worse.
Well, I think if there is one takeaway from this podcast is stop and think before you do something. Just stop and think. And if you feel that this something is wrong, you probably shouldn't do it. And probably your gut feeling is probably right on this. Right? So just stop and think, because a lot of people don't think, they're just kind of floating, they do the same things every day, and they take opportunities as they arrive. But, if you stop and think, it helps.
So if the listener wants to hear about the work that you're doing, where can we find you online?
I have a very simple answer to that. Just Google my name.
This is true.
Just Google my name. You will
find her.
You will find 100 different things that I've done. And I'm on all social media. So if you cannot find me, it's your fault.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with me.
It's a good system for weeding people out. Yeah.
Yeah. If you can't use Google, Ganna is not the person for you. We should mention, however, that Ganna has recently started a YouTube channel, which we will also link down below in the description, because it's absolutely great. And it will tell you even more about behavioral data science, which, is the future. So you should really look into it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, like I said, I don't want to push anybody sort of to listen to my stuff, but I think that if you're interested in these things, just try to find out. Like, for example, you guys are doing great research. People at University of Warwick or at University of Nottingham. University of East Anglia is also a big center for behavioral science. So just try to find, obviously apart from UCL, Oxford and Cambridge, that are the usual suspects. Try to find out who is doing valuable research on behavioral science, and just look at it. You don't have to look at my stuff, but please look at people who actually have publications in peer-reviewed outlets, so that there is some quality to what they're saying. You just don't listen to just anybody, because chances are, I have really weird conversations with people on social media who try to. I recently had a guy who was saying no, there is nudge theory, and he went on rampage on my LinkedIn, just saying. There is nudge theory. You should read Richard Taylor. I'm like, I know Richard Taylor personally. I met him, right? So but he was he was really upset over this. And it's not his fault. It's because he heard that. He heard that in the media, right? He heard it from someone who probably isn't working in the space. And so I just think just look at the credentials of people who are trying to produce something. Yeah, but with me, it's very simple. Just Google.
I love that. Just Google
Fantastic. Me. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast. We've had a lot of fun today.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, my pleasure. And good luck. I know that it's difficult to start a new podcast, so good luck with that.
Okay, guys, that was the amazing Ganna Pogrebna explaining to us how behavioral science can work in policy, should work in policy, and hopefully does work in policy. But of course, as you've managed to reach this stage of the episode, you must have realized that behavioral science and policy aren't always friends, and it can backfire a lot, really badly.
Yeah.
Sarah, what's the main thing that you've learned today?
Well, I really, really enjoyed this new term that's now going to be in my vocabulary, weapons of mass influence, which I think is just great. Yeah. So it's this whole idea about, great power, great responsibility. But yeah, and the fact that anyone with this skill set can kind of really have a huge influence over people's lives. And there doesn't seem to be that much at the moment in terms of regulation or licensing or structures to sort of, anything beyond an individual's own personal ethical compass to sort of, say who should be using these sort of behavioral interventions and what they should be used for, which I thought was quite interesting.
No, absolutely. I think, Ganna already mentions that when it comes to ethics, the researcher really has to look at themselves and their intervention and their motivations for doing it. Now, about an hour too late, I remember that I've recently, and I use the term recently very loosely here, there's a paper has come out, and I don't know who wrote it, but I'll make sure to find and link it in the description, about nudging for good. And then for good is all caps, and that's the name of the framework. And then it's FORGOOD. I think most people would be able to spell that. And then it stands for, every letter stands for what you have to think of when actually coming up with an intervention, creating an intervention, running the intervention, analyzing the intervention, yada, yada, yada. Which I think is an interesting start to look at, you know, what behavioral science can do, could do, shouldn't do, and that type of stuff. But yeah, no, it's quite interesting to see how much of behavioral science with regards to policy is or might be motivated by potentially a lack of research, potentially misinterpretation, and potentially a misalignment of motives when the researcher is compared to the person they're trying to nudge, which I always find interesting.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, we've been talking about the idea of behavioral science being a very, very powerful tool, but something I think that is maybe overlooked sometimes is that, you know, whether or not these interventions are actually effective, it can be really super context dependent. And actually, I think, you know, through all the research that's been done on all these different sort of staple nudge techniques that have sort of come out of public policy, the only textbook nudge that seems to really have a consistent effect is this changing the default.
Oh yeah, that's almost a given for as far as we know, because that hasn't been tested everywhere either. To actually refer back to an earlier episode we recorded with Elena, it's a good question whether everything works everywhere, depending on culture, country, context. Which is now mentioned in this episode. So I think most defaults work because people are lazy. That seems to be a quite universal phenomenon. But even then, I wouldn't be able to say without a shadow of a doubt, yes, default is always effective and is the most effective tool. But it seems to be the most uncontested tool so far. Yeah.
And I think there's, you know, the default nudge is a great place to have this conversation about the ethics of nudging. Yeah. Because they, you know, even in, you know, terms and conditions. So if we look at the term that Thaler's coined, a sludge, right, this idea of nudge for bad, I guess, or a nudge to stop you from doing something that you want to do rather than making something easier. You make something harder, like trying to get out of those spam emails or getting off people's mailing lists. You see defaults used all the time. So I think if we're going to have a debate about the ethics of nudging, defaults are a great place to have that.
Yeah. I think there's in general, there's been a lack of debate. I mean, I'm sure there has been debate on nudging in general. But when it comes to the ethics of nudging, I think there's much more that can be done. Especially, this is a debate that has been held a lot. So this is not what I'm criticizing. But a lot of people are arguing that nudging is way too paternalistic, that it is way too pushy, that it doesn't remove free choice, because that's illegal in quite a few countries. But it does very clearly steer towards a choice that if you're not properly elaborating on a decision that you're making, which most people aren't, which is exactly why we're nudging, that it leads to a very much preferred result. And it should be much more questioned why a certain result is preferred. Yeah.
So, I mean, they talk about it, Sunstein and Thaler, in the book Nudge. They call it libertarian paternalism. But I mean, something that I thought was quite interesting that I picked up on in our conversation with Ganna was some of the examples that she was talking about of effective behavioral policies, such as a smoking ban. And it was quite interesting because in my head, I sort of had this preconception that for an intervention or for a policy to be behavioral, it had to sort of prescribe to this libertarian paternalistic framework of sort of not removing choices, of more steering people. But the idea that a ban can be and should be potentially considered a behavioural intervention was quite interesting to me. That sort of made me think about my preconceptions a little bit more about behavioural public policy.
No, it's actually really good that you mentioned that, because I felt exactly the same. As soon as you said the word ban, I was like, is that behavioral? Like, are we still talking behavioral policy? I thought a ban was very much like legal, like law-based. And I can imagine that, obviously if something becomes against the law in certain situations, that might spill over in other situations as such, demotivating the behavior. I suppose in my mind, but this is just apparently the wrong way to approach it. In my mind, it's the spillover and the demotivation in other areas, which would be the behavioral input, whereas the ban itself would be much more legal or legislative, I suppose you would call it. But I didn't realize that would be behavioral. Like you said, I thought that would be, I don't know, something else, but not behavioral public policy. But it's good to know that it's much broader than we think.
Yeah, I think you can. No, well, I think it's broadened my mind a little bit more, I think, which is always a good thing. But, you could even have the same debate when it comes to financial incentives, right? If we're thinking that behavioral economics or behavioral science is something that's moving us away from this, economic theory-based models of how a government should intervene, it's all about money, fines, financial incentives. So in a certain sense, it's sort of trying to separate what part of behavioral public policy is sort of non-conventional policy and what part of behavioral public policy is just a way of viewing any sort of policy that has some sort of behavioral spillover effects.
No, that's fair. No, it's really interesting. Sometimes fines work. If you're picking up the kids late, apparently they don't work. Sometimes economic incentives work, unless you're like really high up in the pyramid of Maslow, then they might actually not work at all. It's very context dependent, but then again, I think you could put that as a slogan underneath the definition of behavioral science. Behavioral science, it all just depends.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a very satisfying answer, but it's true.
Yeah, it's really dependent on context, culture, people, timing. Oh, there's so many aspects to keep in mind. But yeah, I mean that is, if you want to go into public policy, that is something you're very much going to have to keep in mind, because designing effective strategies or effective policies is going to be much more difficult than to set up an experiment in the lab, get an outcome, and then be like, yes, we now know what this does. Right. Because what happens in the lab stays in the lab, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's this whole debate of generalizability, external validity, blah, 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 blah. But
all these things. But before we dive into external validity, because no offense to you, the audience, if you find that stuff interesting, that's all fine, that's all good. But I'm tuning out of that conversation. So I think with once you've reached the point of external validity, it's time to quit the conversation. So
yeah, that's why I don't get invited to parties, Merle. It's okay, I know this.
I don't think anyone is currently getting invited to parties, Sarah. Like, let's hope the party soon returns. But at least when this episode releases, we hope we'll be able to leave the house again, and we'll see what the future of public policy making has in store for us after the entire stuff with the pandemic is calming down a bit, because that will be an interesting time as well, for policymakers, for researchers. I think for everyone it will be very interesting. But that's a debate for another time, because I'm trying to end this episode.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a great day, a great week, a great month, a great year, a great life. And we hope to see you or have you listen to us on the next one.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Questioning Behaviour. Tune in to our next episode to find out which behaviour we will be questioning next.
A podcast is a bit of a one-way medium. We're talking to you, but you can't actually talk back. If you'd like a more interactive exchange, do reach out to us via our socials. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. Just look for Questioning Behaviour. We're also on Twitter using @QB_podcast. We're looking forward to hearing from you. See ya!
Bye!